I'm Margaret Doyle, 74 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that if you saved enough, worked hard enough, and gave with an open heart, you'd be okay. My husband, Jasper, used to say I was the most practical woman he'd ever met, and I suppose that was true. I kept every receipt paid, every bill on time, and raised our only son with the kind of quiet devotion no one ever noticed. Not really until one morning. Not long ago, I walked into my living room holding a note that said, "Goodbye, old woman. Thanks for the money," and realized my son had vanished before I go any further. Tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button. If you've ever trusted someone only to find yourself completely alone on the other side. I was born in 1949 in Grand Junction, Colorado. The kind of place where folks left their doors unlocked, and everyone knew who sat in which pew. At church, my father was a geologist, quiet, precise, always measuring things. My mother worked at the town library. She taught me to be orderly, to pay attention to small details. They weren't affectionate people, not exactly, but they were steady and dependable, and when you grow up with that, you learn to keep your feet on the ground. I went to the University of Colorado, studied accounting because numbers made sense. They always added up. They didn't lie after graduation. I married Jasper Doyle. He worked in construction, calm man, serious and careful. With his words, he built our house himself in the suburbs of Denver. Not big, but warm, with a porch that creaked and a backyard where I grew tomatoes in neat rows. I became chief accountant for the same construction company where he worked. Not because he pulled strings, but because I earned it, and when our son Calvin came along late, I was already 32. We both poured everything we had into him. He was bright, even clever, but always impatient, wanted shortcuts, wanted more, faster, bigger. Jasper warned me not to coddle him too much, but what can I say? A mother's heart doesn't work like a balance sheet. Calvin tried. College for business management didn't finish. Said he didn't need a degree to make money. Said real learning happened in the field. He bounced between jobs. Always had a reason why the last one didn't work out. Said bosses didn't get him. Coworkers dragged him down. He'd come over for dinner, and I'd listen while he talked about his next big plan, then slip him a check for groceries or rent. When Jasper died 15 years ago, it was sudden heart attack at work. We'd argued that morning over a fence repair. He said, I spent too much on little things. I never thought those would be the last words he spoke to me after the funeral. I sold the house, couldn't bear the memories, downsized to a small place downtown, and started tucking away every dollar I had. By the time I retired, I'd saved close to $1 million 3 years ago. Calvin met Jessica, a sharp young woman 10 years his junior, worked as a loan officer at a regional bank. She was put together, always had a plan, didn't smile much, but knew what she wanted. I liked her right away. Thought maybe she'd help Calvin find some direction. They got married quietly and settled into a rental near me. I cooked for them, helped out wherever I could. Didn't matter how old Calvin was. He was still my boy. One afternoon in October, he came over in a suit with that determined look in his eye, the same one Jasper used to get when he was about to pour a concrete foundation. "Mom, I've got something big to show you," he said and laid a folder on my kitchen table. Smelled like cinnamon in the house. "I'd just baked an apple pie," he said. They'd done research, taken courses, drawn up spreadsheets. He and Jessica wanted to open a restaurant in the Highlands, mid-range modern American menu with fusion elements. He talked about market gaps and target customers. Jessica arrived soon after, pulled out her laptop and showed me charts, competitor analysis, foot traffic projections. The whole thing looked professional. Not a dream. Plan they needed $800,000 to launch, and they weren't asking for a handout. They wanted a business partner. Said I'd get 40% of the profits with legal protections, veto power, and a buyout clause. After 3 years, I told them I needed time to think. That night I sat up, running the numbers again and again, Jasper's voice in my head like a quiet echo. Don't give the boy more than you can afford to lose. I looked through old paperwork, ran down every risk, wrote out the pros and cons. The truth is, they'd prepared, and I'd always said, if Calvin ever got serious, I'd help him. So 3 days later, I called him. But I didn't say yes to 800. I offered 980, with one condition. Every detail had to be in writing through a lawyer. I told him, this was everything I had, and I couldn't do it again. He cried, said he wouldn't let me down, swore it on his father's memory. We met at the bank, signed the contracts, transferred the funds he gave me. Roses, white ones said thank you and promised I'd be proud. I watched them walk out that day, full of plans and possibility. I believed I'd just given them a future I didn't know, that in less than a week I'd find myself staring at an empty apartment and 2 short lines that would change everything. The phones stayed quiet all night. By morning, I had called each of them at least 20 times. Calvin's line rang, but no one picked up. Jessica's went straight to voicemail. At noon, I couldn't sit there anymore. I grabbed my coat and walked the 3 blocks to their apartment. When I got there, I rang the buzzer. Nothing. I knocked. Still nothing. I pulled out the spare key Calvin had given me for emergencies, thinking maybe they'd overslept or something had happened. When I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Then I saw the kitchen. The table was clear. No mugs in the sink. No jackets on the hook by the door. I walked to the bedroom and opened the closet. Empty hangers. The bathroom, no towels, no toothbrushes. It wasn't just quiet. It was bare. On the kitchen counter sat a single envelope with my name on it. Calvin's handwriting. I opened it slowly. Just one line inside. Sorry, but there was no other way. Don't look for us. That was it. No explanation. No contact information. No reason. I moved from room to room, pulling open drawers, flipping through cabinets, checking under the bed. It was like they'd vanished overnight. No framed photos, no bills on the table, not even a receipt left behind. I stood in the middle of the living room and felt my knees wobble. The folder with the business plan, the menu ideas, the charts they'd shown me gone. Back home, I sat by the window and called Calvin again. Nothing. Then I called the bank where Jessica worked. The receptionist told me Jessica had handed in her resignation yesterday, said it had been processed immediately. But she was with me yesterday at another bank, I said, confused. The receptionist paused, then added, she couldn't give out any more information. I stared out the window for a long time. I kept trying to come up with explanations that made sense. Maybe there was trouble. Maybe something happened. Maybe they were running from someone, not from me. I kept circling that hope, but each time it grew thinner. That evening, I remembered their upstairs neighbor, Mrs. Connors. She was the type to notice everything, never missed a package delivery or a change in the weather. I knocked on her door just as she was settling in for the night. "Oh, Margaret, I was thinking of calling you," she said, tugging her robe closed. "They moved out this morning. Early. Around 6, I think. Suitcases, bags, even called one of those big vans to take them to the airport. I figured maybe they were going on a honeymoon or something." "What else did you see?" I asked her. "Well, they were outside for a bit before they left. In the back lot. Looked like they were burning something in a metal bucket. Papers, maybe." "Papers?" "Yep. Didn't say a word to me. Just heard him say to her, 'Hurry up. The plane won't wait.'" I left feeling cold all over. I didn't sleep that night. I went back the next day, checked the bucket in the yard. There were only ashes and a few charred scraps left. Most had burned, but I could still read one torn piece. Flight 1247, and part of a word that looked like Bangkok. Bangkok. Thailand. I went home and sat on the couch. The quiet in my apartment was the heaviest it had ever been. I checked the mailbox again as if something else might show up. Nothing. For 3 days, I barely ate. I stared at my phone waiting for it to ring, hoping it would be Calvin saying it was all a mistake, but the silence stretched on. Then on Friday evening, my phone lit up. It was Sheila McGregor, an old friend who lived out in California. We used to visit when Jasper was alive. "Margaret, honey, are you all right?" she asked, her voice light but uncertain. "I saw Calvin's pictures online. Didn't know you'd sent them off to the tropics." "What pictures?" I asked. "Oh, they're all over Facebook. Looks like a honeymoon or something. He posted them yesterday, Jessica and him in front of a big fancy villa. Pool, ocean, the works. Says, a new life begins today." I figured you'd be thrilled. I asked her to send the link. Told her I was having trouble with my connection. When it came through, I stared at the screen. There they were. My son and his wife in front of a white villa with a tiled roof and an ocean view, a swimming pool behind them, cocktails in hand, matching sunglasses. More photos followed Jessica in a designer swimsuit by the water, Calvin grinning behind the wheel of a bright red convertible. The final photo had a caption renting this villa for a year. "Best decision we've ever made. Thailand, we love you." I sat back in the chair. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. They had taken the money and left. Not for a restaurant, not for a business. They'd taken it and flown halfway across the world to live in luxury. I called Ruth. I needed to tell someone. She was quiet at first. Then she said, "Margaret, call the police. This is fraud. This is theft." I wasn't sure. I'd signed the documents. I'd transferred the money willingly. It was supposed to be a business investment. They had even promised to return it. But the notes, the disappearance, the sudden vacation, it all pointed to something else. That night, I searched online for the villa. I found the resort's name in one of the photos, Paradise Beach, Phuket. The most expensive listings went up to $30,000 a month. I found a villa that matched the one in Calvin's pictures. It cost $25,000 a month. They'd already spent at least $300,000 on housing alone. The next day, I walked into the police station and asked to file a report. The officer was polite but cautious. "You gave the money voluntarily," he said. "Unless there's direct proof they never intended to open a business, it's hard to prove fraud." "What about the notes?" I asked. "Not enough. They're cruel, yes, but not criminal. Not on their own." I went home with nothing. No leads, no help. Later that evening, I checked Facebook again. More photos. Dinner on a yacht. Shopping bags from luxury stores. Smiling like nothing had ever happened. That night, I realized what hurt more than the money was the silence. The finality of it. Not a goodbye, not a reason, just gone. I sat with the lights off, watching the sun go down through the window. I thought about Jasper, what he would have said, what he would have done. The man who always said, if you let a man fall, he might learn to stand. I didn't know if Calvin would ever stand again. But I knew I wasn't going to fall with him. And the next morning, for the first time in days, I got dressed. I made a list. And I reached for the drawer where I kept all our old paperwork because the next part of this story wasn't going to be about waiting. It was going to be about finding out exactly how much I could still take back. The living room felt colder after that. I turned the thermostat up twice, but the air still had that empty kind of chill, the kind that doesn't come from weather. I stopped checking the mailbox. I kept the curtains half drawn. Days blurred together. I'd make coffee in the morning and forget to drink it. The pot would sit there full and cold until evening. I answered the phone when Ruth called, when Sheila left voicemails, but I never picked it up myself. I opened my laptop each night more out of habit than anything else. Calvin hadn't changed his privacy settings. His profile was still wide open. I kept clicking through the photos even after I knew each one by heart. The resort had long marble walkways lined with palm trees. Every sunset behind them was perfect, like someone had brushed it onto the sky with a painter's hand. Jessica posed by the edge of a private infinity pool. Her hair curled, a glass of champagne in her hand. Calvin had tagged her in a post that read, "Freedom tastes like this." Some nights I found myself typing replies in the comment box. Just a few words. Then I'd stop. Backspace. Shut the laptop. It was strange watching someone live a life you didn't recognize. The son I remembered had crooked teeth until junior year. He used to trail after Jasper with a little plastic tape measure measuring fence posts and stair steps. Now he was tan, leaner somehow, wearing crisp button-down shirts I'd never seen before. He smiled in every photo, but the smile didn't look like his. I didn't cry much. Not at first. I sat. I listened to the hum of the fridge. I noticed dust collecting under the bookcase. Jasper's toolbox still sat under the laundry sink where he'd left it 15 years ago. I opened it one afternoon, then closed it again. The third night, I woke up around 2 a.m. Couldn't get back to sleep. I walked into the kitchen and stared at the paper towel roll. I don't know how long I stood there. Eventually, I opened the pantry and rearranged the canned goods. Corn in one row, soup in another. Then I scrubbed the stovetop, cleaned the sink, washed the curtains. I worked until the sun came up. I skipped the news, turned off the radio. The silence didn't bother me as much as the noise did. I couldn't stand hearing stories about other people's grown children calling home asking what time dinner was. Each day, I waited for something to change. A message, a knock at the door. The mail carrier's steps in the hall would make me pause, but it was never for me. I tried calling again just once. It rang twice and went to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. On the 5th day, a package arrived. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, not even in an envelope, typed. No signature. Don't contact us again. We're doing what we need to do. We're not coming back. That night, I unplugged the laptop and put it in the hall closet. I moved slowly through the days, paid bills, watered the plants, took out the trash. I swept the porch even though no one visited. I cooked just enough to keep things normal: oatmeal in the morning, soup, or toast at night. Sometimes I'd make a full meal and sit at the table across from an empty chair. I'd eat in silence, then I'd wash the plate and put it back on the rack. Ruth stopped by on a Sunday afternoon. She brought lemon muffins and a casserole. I let her in. We sat quietly for a while, then she asked, "Have you thought about seeing someone?" "A counselor?" "I'm fine," I said. "I just worry. You're not yourself." I thanked her, told her I appreciated the muffins. She didn't stay long. Later that week, I started pulling out the old folders, tax records, bank statements, the trust paperwork Jasper and I had set up when Calvin was a teenager. Everything was still there, filed neatly in manila envelopes with labeled tabs. I didn't know what I was looking for. I just needed to see it, to remind myself that once upon a time, things had made sense. In one folder, tucked behind an old power bill, I found something I'd forgotten about: a copy of the durable power of attorney I'd drawn up after Jasper died. Calvin had signed it 6 years ago before a minor surgery. He'd never revoked it. The language was dry but clear. I had access to certain assets in the event he became unavailable. It wasn't everything, but it was something. I stared at it for a long time. Then I made a fresh pot of coffee, sat down at the table with a notepad, and started writing down questions. Where had the rest of the money gone? How much had they spent already? Did they open any other accounts before they left? I listed out every place I knew Calvin had banked over the years, even the ones from his college days. I circled one Fremont Federal. Jessica had worked there. The next morning, I pressed my skirt, brushed my hair, and walked 3 blocks to the bus stop. I hadn't been on a bus in over a year. The ride downtown took 40 minutes. I stepped off in front of the granite-faced building and walked through the doors of Fremont Federal with my folder clutched tight under one arm. A man in his 40s greeted me in the lobby. His badge read Michael Sterling. I recognized him from church potlucks years ago. "Mrs. Doyle," he said, "I haven't seen you in, goodness, since your retirement. What can I help with?" I handed him the papers. He looked them over carefully. "Let's go into my office," he said. Behind closed doors, I explained everything. What I'd invested, what had happened, the notes, the sudden departure, the photos online. Michael listened without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "I'll check our internal records. If Calvin or Jessica still have active accounts here, and if your documentation still holds, I may be able to help you access some information." He left the room for nearly 20 minutes. When he came back, he sat down across from me with a file folder. "There's still one active joint account under Calvin's name," he said. "Jessica isn't on it. The balance right now is $472,615. I didn't say anything. Michael adjusted his glasses. "Would you like to initiate a hold on the account?" I opened my mouth, then closed it. I looked down at the copy of the signature Calvin had scribbled years ago just under Jasper's witness line. Then I looked back up at Michael and said yes. I would. Michael said the hold would take 24 hours. Long enough to prevent any withdrawals. He told me the money couldn't be transferred without a signed release, and my power of attorney gave me the right to request a temporary freeze under suspicion of fraud. It wasn't a full solution, but it was something solid. He slid a copy of the authorization across the desk. I signed it. My hand shook only once. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and made a new list. This one was short. One item, find out how they did it, how they moved the money, where it went. I knew there had to be more. Calvin and Jessica were clever. They wouldn't have left everything in one account, not if they were serious about disappearing. The next morning, I called Ruth. She had a cousin, Ellen, who worked at a private accounting firm in Milford. I asked if she'd be willing to take a look at the trust setup. "Of course," Ruth said. "Ellen's sharp. She'll know where to look." By that afternoon, I had a meeting on the books. Ellen met me in a modest office above a dental practice. She wore a navy cardigan and had a desk lined with framed photos of 3 boys and a golden retriever. I laid out the documents, copies of the investment transfer, the trust details, the old power of attorney, and the most recent bank statement Michael had provided. Ellen looked through them slowly, then leaned back. "They opened a revocable grantor trust," she said. "Standard on the surface, but look here." She pointed to a line midway through the document. "They routed the funds through a shell LLC registered in Nevada. That's one way to shield movement of funds." "Is that legal?" I asked. "Technically, yes, but paired with their sudden exit and the fact that you believed it was going toward a joint business, there may be something here." She paused and looked me in the eye. "Do you want me to dig deeper?" I nodded. Ellen spent the next 2 days tracing what she could. On the 3rd day, she called me in. They moved nearly 700 Dagcoins across 4 different accounts in 3 states. Some of it is likely offshore by now, but there's one active U.S. account still holding roughly $93,000 registered under the LLC's name. She handed me a printout with the routing info. "You can't freeze this one without legal action, but now that we've mapped it, you have something substantial. If you want to take this to an attorney, I can write a summary of findings." I thanked her, slid the folder into my purse. I walked out of her office and sat in the car for a long while. The sky was that pale winter blue, not quite cold enough for snow, but sharp enough to sting the inside of your nose. I thought about the way Calvin used to hold my hand when crossing the street, the way Jessica had called me Mom the day after they married. I thought about the look on Calvin's face the last time we hugged tight like he meant it, and then I thought about the signatures on those documents. His, mine, side by side. I drove home and called an attorney. His name was Mark Riley, early 50s, practiced in estate and trust law for nearly 20 years. His office was near the courthouse, tucked between a florist and a bakery. He wore a brown wool blazer and kept a bowl of peppermints on the reception desk. After reviewing everything, he leaned back and said, "There's potential here, especially if we can show they misrepresented the purpose of the investment to gain control over your funds. But I signed the transfer," I reminded him. "Yes, but intent matters. If they pitched you a business and never intended to follow through, we're not talking about a simple bad investment. We're talking misrepresentation. Possibly wire fraud." He laid out next steps. We'd file a petition in probate court to review the trust activity. Simultaneously, we'd notify the bank holding the LLC funds and request a temporary injunction. If granted, it would prevent further transfers. It would take time, he warned. Months, maybe longer. But if I was willing to see it through, we had a case. I left his office with a file full of paperwork and a pen in my coat pocket. I stopped by the bakery next door and bought a single cinnamon roll, walked back to the bus stop with the bag warm in my hands. At home, I called Sheila, told her everything. She listened without interrupting, then said softly, "You're stronger than most would be." I didn't know about that. I only knew I had to keep going, not out of spite, just because, if I didn't try, I'd never stop wondering. Over the next week, I gathered every bit of documentation Mark needed. I sat at my desk from morning until late afternoon, reading through statements, flagging dates, making copies. I kept a notebook with tabs, one for the trust, one for the LLC, one for Jessica's employment history, one for my own investment correspondence. By Friday, Mark filed the petition. A court date was set for the following month. That night, I allowed myself one small moment of quiet. I sat on the back porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The air smelled like dry leaves and the neighbor's wood stove. I stared out across the yard. The swing Jasper built was still hanging from the old oak. I hadn't sat on it since the summer after he passed. I stood up, walked over, and sat. The wood creaked beneath me. The rope held steady. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in weeks, I breathed a little easier. The mailbox had been quiet for days, mostly flyers and catalogs. But that morning, I opened the box and found a padded envelope wedged behind a stack of circulars. No return address, just my name handwritten in black ink. I carried it inside and laid it on the counter next to the coffee pot. I let it sit there for an hour before opening it. Inside was a folded letter, thick paper, the kind you'd buy from a proper stationery shop. There was a scent on it, faint lavender, or something close. The handwriting was neat, slanted slightly to the right. I recognized it immediately. Jessica. I unfolded the page and started to read. She wrote that they hadn't planned for things to unfold this way. That the opportunity came up quickly, too quickly to explain. She said Calvin had struggled for years, feeling trapped, responsible, limited by obligations he never asked for. She said they used the money for freedom, for a new life, for a chance to start fresh without guilt. She ended the letter by asking me not to pursue legal action. It won't change the outcome, she wrote, and it won't bring peace. There was no apology, no contact number, no location. Just a postscript that read, "Don't involve outsiders. Let this end here." I read it twice, then folded it again and placed it back in the envelope. I slid it into the bottom drawer of the old roll-top desk Jasper had used for decades. I didn't need to reread it again. The meaning was clear. That afternoon, I took the envelope to Mark. He read it quietly, didn't say much. Then he asked if I wanted to add it to our filing. Yes, I said. It may not admit to wrongdoing, but it shows intent. He nodded and tucked the letter into the folder. I'll request it be included in the hearing documentation. By then, the court date was just under 3 weeks away. While we waited, I went back through the trust records again. I found a receipt from a printing company dated 6 months before they left. It was addressed to Calvin's name, and the order summary listed letterhead design professional cards brochures. I called the number on the receipt. The woman on the other end confirmed they'd printed branded materials for Doyle Consulting Group. That business had never existed in any of the paperwork I signed. I asked if she had a sample on file. She said, "Hang on a second," and came back with a digital archive. She described a logo, simple serif font navy and silver. The tagline beneath it read, "Legacy Strategies for a Modern World." I thanked her, wrote it down, and hung up. The name didn't appear anywhere in the original documents. It wasn't registered as an LLC in our state. It was branding only just enough to dress things up and make them look legitimate. It made me think back to a box Calvin had brought home 6 months before everything happened. He'd said it was filled with prototypes for marketing. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. He'd taken it upstairs and shut the door. The more I looked, the more I realized how long this had been in motion. He hadn't stumbled into a bad choice. This had been planned. Quietly, carefully, piece by piece. With the hearing approaching, Mark asked if I wanted to prepare a short statement, something personal. He said it wasn't required, but sometimes it helped the judge understand the human side of a dispute. I sat down that evening and wrote in longhand. I wrote about Jasper, about how we'd saved steadily, carefully for decades, about the nights he spent reviewing statements highlighting margins in yellow. I wrote about the moment I'd signed over the transfer papers to Calvin and how I'd felt proud. Proud that he'd found something of his own, that he wanted to build something real. I ended the page with a single sentence: "Trust is not something you can amend." I handed it to Mark the day before the hearing. We met at the courthouse early. The sky was gray. The flag above the entrance flapped hard in the wind. The courtroom itself was small. Pale wood benches, soft lighting. No jury, just a single judge seated behind the raised bench. Calvin and Jessica weren't there. Their lawyer appeared alone. He wore a tailored suit and carried a slim black briefcase. He argued that the money had been given freely, that no written agreement had ever bound it to specific use, and that I had, in his words, grown confused about the purpose of the trust. Mark countered with clarity. He laid out the financial trail, the letter, the marketing materials, the Shell LLC. Then he submitted my statement along with the evidence of misrepresentation. The judge asked a few direct questions. Then she asked to review the materials in chambers. We were told we'd receive her decision within 10 business days. Mark and I left the courthouse quietly. He offered to treat me to coffee down the block. I said yes. We sat by the window of a small cafe, our cups warming our hands. He said, "No matter how it ends, you've already made them answer for what they did." I didn't respond. I looked out the window and watched a boy and his mother cross the street together, their hands clasped. The boy's backpack had a keychain on it, a little wooden compass swinging in the wind. 10 days passed without a word. Then on the 11th, I heard the mail slot click around noon. I'd just taken a loaf of bread out of the oven. The scent of cinnamon lingered in the kitchen, and for a moment, I debated letting the envelope sit. But I wiped my hands on a towel and picked it up. It was from the county court. A standard legal envelope, heavy and creased from travel. I walked it to the dining table, sat down, and opened it. The decision was printed on plain white paper. 1 page, single-spaced. It opened with the judge's name, the case number, and a brief summary of the petition. My name, Calvin's, Jessica's. then the body of the ruling. I read it slowly, once, then again. The judge had ruled in my favor. She found that the transfer of funds had been secured under materially misleading representations and that the actions taken by Calvin and Jessica constituted a breach of fiduciary responsibility and ethical misconduct under trust law. The court granted a partial injunction on the remaining domestic assets, specifically the account holding the $93,000. That amount would be restored to my estate pending further review. Additional damages were being referred for civil arbitration. I placed the letter down on the table and stared at the wood grain. There was no celebration in the room, just quiet, stillness. But it was the kind that lets your shoulders drop an inch for the first time in weeks. I called Mark. He picked up on the second ring. "Good news," I said. He already knew. The court had sent him a copy. He congratulated me, gently, said this was just the beginning, and told me the next steps would involve an asset review, then formal recovery. "We'll file the injunction notice with the bank today," he said. "They'll freeze the account immediately." I thanked him and hung up. Later that afternoon, I walked to the library. It wasn't something I'd planned. I just needed to be somewhere quiet and familiar. I sat in the genealogy room in the back where Jasper and I used to pore over old land records. The same desk was there, still polished, still facing the window that overlooked the elm trees. I stayed until closing. That evening, I called Ruth. She didn't say "I told you so." She just asked if I wanted company. We sat in my living room with mugs of hot tea. She asked what came next. I said I wasn't sure, but that I wanted to take a few days before diving back into it. 2 mornings later, Mark left a voicemail. A contact at the State Banking Commission had flagged a secondary account tied to the same LLC. Smaller balance, less than $20,000, but still relevant. He'd already submitted the paperwork to freeze it. They were thorough, he said, but not quite thorough enough. By the following week, both accounts were under court hold. A month after that, the arbitration hearing was scheduled. Calvin and Jessica didn't appear. Their attorney attended via conference line and issued a brief statement. "My clients deny any fraudulent intent and maintain that all funds were used in accordance with a good faith business venture." The arbitrator, a retired federal judge, wasn't impressed. She reviewed the evidence, asked a handful of questions, and then stated she would issue her decision within 5 business days. It arrived by email. The award full return of all traceable funds, including interest and legal fees. The arbitrator also ruled that the trust would be dissolved with remaining assets returned to the grantor's estate, my estate. I forwarded the email to Mark, then printed a copy and pinned it to the bulletin board above my desk. That night, I pulled the old quilt from the cedar chest and laid it across the bed. Jasper's quilt. The one he'd used through every Michigan winter. I hadn't brought it out in years. The scent of cedar was faint, but still there. I lay down early and listened to the wind moving through the trees. For the first time in months, I slept through the night. In the days that followed, Mark began the recovery process. A formal distribution plan would be drafted. Some of the funds might take longer to reclaim, especially anything routed offshore. But what mattered most had already been secured. A week later, the envelope came. This time, it wasn't from the court. It was from Calvin. His handwriting was still neat. The envelope was postmarked from Arizona. I sat at the kitchen table again. The same chair. The same time of day. I opened it slowly. He wrote that he understood the decision, that he hoped I'd find closure in it. He said they were rebuilding, starting something small, and that Jessica was working part-time. He didn't apologize. He didn't mention Jasper. He ended with a line that read, "I know you think I failed you, but I had to choose the life that made sense to me." I folded the letter and slid it into the drawer beside Jessica's. Then I made a call to Mark. There's no need to respond, I said. He agreed. That afternoon, I walked through the garden. The frost had lifted, and the daffodils were starting to push through. The air was soft for February, a little warmer than usual. I sat on the porch and watched the shadows stretch across the lawn. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then went quiet. There wasn't a sense of triumph, but there was something steadier than that, a kind of stillness that didn't ask for anything in return. The house had been quiet for weeks, the kind of quiet that settles in your bones. I kept the TV off, left the radio unplugged. Even the clock in the hallway had stopped ticking. I didn't wind it, didn't feel the need. Then one morning, just after I poured my coffee, there was a knock at the front door. I waited a second, unsure if I'd imagined it. Then another knock came. Firmer. I set the mug down and walked to the entryway. Through the glass, I could see a man standing on the porch. Mid-40s, maybe. Wore a field jacket and held a worn brown envelope under one arm. He had the kind of posture that said he wasn't selling anything. Not nervous, just still. I opened the door halfway. "Can I help you?" He took off his cap. "Are you Mrs. Halbrook?" "Yes." "My name's Thomas Lambert. I work with Legacy Reconciliation Services. We help track and restore improperly transferred estates and family trusts." I narrowed my eyes. "I'm not interested in any new filings." He smiled gently. "This isn't a solicitation. I'm here because your case came across our database last year. We followed it through arbitration. What happened to your estate? It caught our attention." I didn't know what to say. He shifted slightly. "I'd like to show you something. It's not a claim, not a request. Just a review. No commitment on your part." I stepped aside and opened the door fully. "Come in." He followed me to the dining room and placed the envelope on the table. Inside were copies of transactions dated over the last 3 years. Most had nothing to do with the domestic accounts I'd recovered. Offshore Movement's smaller LLCs, one registered out of a mailbox office in Utah. These accounts, he said, tapping the page, show a pattern. Small withdrawals from what appear to be shell firms, all routed through a trust your son used to own. One that was never disclosed in your filings. I sat down slowly. "Why bring this to me now?" "Because your arbitration ruling included a clause allowing for future discoveries tied to the original asset pool. That means these accounts are technically still within reach, but we needed to confirm that with you directly." I looked through the documents. I didn't recognize most of the firm names, but one address listed in Tempe, Arizona, matched the return address from Calvin's last letter. "Do you know how much is in these accounts?" I asked. He nodded. "Preliminary estimate is a little over $70,000. Not life-changing, but it's yours. And you can recover it. We can help initiate the process, but it will require your authorization." I sat back. The house creaked slightly as the furnace clicked on. I looked out the window at the bare maple tree. It had been stripped clean, not a single leaf left. I turned back to Thomas. "Let's begin." He nodded. "We'll draft the request and send it to your counsel by Friday." After he left, I sat in the dining room and reread the papers. Not out of anger, not even surprise, just quiet recognition. A week later, Mark called. He confirmed the documents were legitimate and had already started the process. "I'll handle the rest," he said. "You don't need to lift a finger." Another 7 weeks passed before the funds were returned. Mark wired them into my local account and sent a single-line email, "Recovery complete. You are now whole." I walked to the bank the next morning and made a deposit into the town's Historic Preservation Fund. It was something Jasper and I had always talked about doing. The donation would help restore the old mill house by the river. On the walk back, I passed by the community center. They'd posted a flyer for the annual harvest dinner. Ruth's name was on the planning committee list. That evening I called her. "I saw the flyer," I said. She laughed. You coming this year? I think I will. A few days later, I baked a peach cobbler and dropped it off at the center. Ruth was inside folding tablecloths. She gave me a nod as I placed the dish down. Outside, the wind had picked up. Autumn had fully arrived. You could smell it in the leaves and feel it in your sleeves. That night, I stood on the porch, a mug in hand, and watched the sky darken over the hills. No calls came. No letters. Just the silence of a place I had rebuilt not with anger, but with intention. There was peace in that. I was folding linens in the laundry room when I noticed an envelope tucked beneath the side table by the front door. No stamp. Just my name written in a handwriting I hadn't seen in years. It was Calvin's. I held it for a moment before opening it. The paper was creased as if he'd folded and unfolded it several times before leaving it there. The note was brief. He wrote that he'd heard the arbitration had closed, that he knew I'd never look at him the same, and that he wasn't asking me to. He said he was sorry. Not for what he'd done, he didn't go that far, but for what it had cost me. And then one line written in smaller letters at the bottom. You were right to shut the door. I read it twice, then placed it in this kitchen drawer where I keep old receipts and spare stamps. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant. It was more like a chapter being sealed, a soft thud instead of a bang. Later that week, Ruth came over with her granddaughter Madison. The little one ran around the yard while Ruth and I sat on the back porch sipping iced tea. She asked if I'd heard from anyone in the family lately. I told her about the note, and she just nodded. Closure comes in strange ways, she said. I looked out across the field where the wildflowers had started to grow again. I'd let the far end of the yard go natural this year. Jasper would have liked that. He used to say not everything needed trimming to be beautiful. That night, I pulled out the small cedar box where I'd kept our wedding photo, a pressed camellia from our anniversary trip, and the hospital bracelet from the day I brought Calvin home. I held the bracelet for a long while. Then I set it back and closed the lid. I slept better that night than I had in months. In the weeks that followed, I helped organize the harvest dinner with Ruth and the others. I signed up to bake cornbread and bring the folding chairs. It felt good to say yes to things again. Not out of obligation, but because I wanted to. I still don't know where Calvin went, or if I'll ever hear from him again. But I know this, I didn't lose my life when I lost my son. I rebuilt it, and I did it without bitterness. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive in a courtroom. Sometimes it shows up quietly, in a cleared account, in a silent house finally at peace, or in the steady voice you find again when you speak your own name without apology. I'm Margaret Halbrook. This is my home, and I'm still here. If you've ever had to start over with nothing but your name and your dignity, I'd love to know your story. Feel free to share it in the comments, and thank you for listening.